Olá, bom dia a todos que estão aqui conosco. Continuando agora a nossa programação, né, do nosso 7º encontro e por falar em tradução. Muito obrigado a quem estiver assistindo aí do outro lado. Hoje nós teremos a palestra com a nossa convidada, a professora Sharon O'Brien, da Dublin City University. Thank you, Sharon, for being with us. We're glad to have you here. E também teremos como mediador o nosso colega, professor Bruno Carlucci, professor da UNB, e ele é que vai mediar e vai traduzir as perguntas de vocês, né, que estão assistindo, para a professora Sharon, para ela responder depois da palestra dela. Também conosco aqui nós temos os intérpretes, Fernando Parente, Gabriel Nascimento e Vitória Tassara. Muito obrigado por estarem aqui conosco. E para quem quiser acompanhar, né, por Libras, a palestra tem o link aí no chat do YouTube para vocês irem para aquela sala, para vocês irem para a sala da interpretação. Então é isso, né? Passo a palavra agora para o Bruno e bom evento para todos nós. Obrigado, Bruno. Thank you, Sharon.
Obrigado, Adriano. Bom dia a todos. Good morning, Sharon. We are delighted to have you here. Então, eu vou falar brevemente do currículo da professora Sharon. Ela é professora na área dos estudos da tradução na Dublin City University, no departamento, né, de línguas aplicadas e estudos interculturais. E lá ela ensina tradução, tecnologia, linguagem e tecnologia, localização, métodos de pesquisa, tradução em contextos de crise, né, que é o tema da sua fala de hoje, da sua palestra de hoje, dentre outros tópicos. Ela também atua como Associate Dean for Research in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Science. Ela também é coeditora do Journal Translation, Cognition and Behavior, publicado pela John Benjamins, e ela foi coordenadora da EU-funded International Network in Crisis Translation. Então, ela foi uma investigadora, uma pesquisadora em The Science Foundation Ireland National Research Center, ADAPT, por mais de 10 anos. E o título da palestra de hoje dela, hoje será Translation's Role in Crisis Prevention, Management and Response. Então, como o Adriano falou, né, quem quiser mandar perguntas, pode mandar diretamente em inglês ou em português, e eu traduzo a pergunta para o inglês. So, Sharon, the word is yours. Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Bruno and Adriano. I will just share my screen first of all. Hopefully everyone can see those slides, yeah. First of all, I want to say thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak to you today online. And good morning to you. It's just a little bit in the afternoon for me, but hopefully everybody is awake. And I'm looking forward to telling you a little bit about my research and my research in collaboration with some of my colleagues on translation in crisis prevention, management and response. As was said in the introduction, I'm in Dublin City University. Some of you perhaps were already in Ireland and Dublin, but if you haven't been, I just wanted to show you where we are located. So you see here the city centre of Dublin, and DCU is just slightly north of the city centre, quite near the airport. So if any of you ever come to visit, we are very close to the airport. Here you can see just a couple of pictures of one of our campuses. So we have 3 campuses on the north side of Dublin, all within 20 to 25 minutes walking distance from each other. This is the main campus in Glasnevin. And as you can see, we're a relatively young and modern university. So that's the introduction to DCU. I would like to now just give you a quick overview of what I hope to talk about for the next hour or so. So first of all, I'm going to give you a little bit of context around the areas that feed into the concept of crisis translation. So I'll talk a bit about disaster studies, crisis communication, and globalization, and how that all relates to the role of translation and interpreting in crisis. We've been doing quite a bit of research on this in the last 10 years, and the research is growing. But I want to tell you just a little bit about some of the focal points of that research. So obviously I won't cover everything, but I will focus in on certain points. And towards the end, then I want to talk a little bit about what a future research agenda might look like. We might start by asking the question, what exactly is a crisis if we're talking about translation and crisis translation? And in the English language, at least, we talk about crises, emergencies, and disasters, and we often use these terms very interchangeably. However, they can always be differentiated in terms of the duration of the event, maybe the cause of the event, and the scale of the event. So what I have for you here is an explanation or a definition from Quarantelli from 1998 about what a disaster is. As you can see, it says it's a sudden onset event that seriously disrupts the routines of collective units. It causes the adoption of unplanned courses of action in order to adjust to this disruption. It has unexpected life histories that are delineated in social space and time, and they often pose danger to valued social objects. So this is, I think, an interesting explanation of what a disaster is. However, you can see from the title of Quarantelli's edited volume here, a dozen perspectives on the question, that there is no agreed definition of what a crisis is or what a disaster is. So we will use these terms interchangeably. I will probably talk a bit about disasters, but I'll talk about crisis, and I'll also try to explain to you what we mean by crisis translation. But first of all, let's look at the fields of disaster studies, which is a very well-established field of scholarly research. From Landau et al.'s paper in 2019, they trace the formal study of disasters to a doctoral dissertation that was done in 1920 at Columbia University by Samuel Henry Prince, which was entitled Catastrophe and Social Change. And this is seen to be one of the first systematic studies of disaster and its impact on society. You can see from the photo here that this was a considerable catastrophic event, which was caused by the collision of two ships in Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1917. And there were 1,963 people killed and 9,000 injured. So you might very well ask, how could the collision of two ships cause such devastation? But in fact, the ships were carrying munitions. So what happened was similar to a bomb going off. And you can see that devastation here. However, Alexander from 2017 suggests that actually the formal study of disasters and its societal impact can be traced back to the 1883 eruption of Krakatoa, which was documented by Simmons in 1888. So he traces the origins of disaster studies back even further. During the 1940s and the 1950s then, in the Cold War era, there was a lot of research done in the US that focused on the social, psychological aspects of disasters, looking at what if kind of scenarios and how we could expect people to behave if a nuclear bomb was exploded, for example. So that's a little bit of background about disaster studies. The other area that feeds into what we call crisis translation is the field of crisis communication, which I'm sure you've all heard of and are familiar with. This field is relatively young compared to disaster studies. Heath and O'Hare from 2009 trace this, the establishment of the field to the 1980s and to a particular case where there was Tylenol tampering in 1982 at the firm Johnson & Johnson. So when we hear about crisis communication these days, we often think about business, and reputation management. And of course, there's the whole field of crisis communication that is linked to reputation management. And translation plays a role there too. But that's not the area that myself and my colleagues have been interested in to date. In fact, we've been more interested in the type of crisis like pandemics, earthquakes, flooding, and the communication that's required during those kind of crises, and how translation and interpreting play a role. Now, all of this has to be situated in the context of globalization as well. So with globalization, we've seen increasing migration, with increasing multilingualism in areas that were not necessarily very multilingual previously. And with that comes an increasing need for translation, and especially during cascading crises. So we use the term cascading here to mean an event that is a crisis of some kind that causes another event, and that perhaps causes another event. So you have a cascading effect of the crisis itself. The need for translation and interpreting, and to think about multilingual communication in these kind of scenarios, became very obvious to all of us during the pandemic. So what is crisis translation then? This is really an umbrella term that my colleagues and I use to just talk about the need for translation and interpreting in these kind of scenarios. In reviewing literature in disaster studies and crisis communication, it became very obvious to us in our early stages that the need for multilingual and multicultural approaches to crisis communication had been overlooked, both in terms of the scholarship and in terms of practice. Seeger, who's one of the main commentators on crisis communication, published in 2016 10 best practices for crisis communication, but he doesn't even mention multilingualism. One of his best practices does state communicate with compassion, concern, and empathy. And for those of us who work in translation, we would understand that to mean and in a language that the person can understand. But this is rarely called out explicitly in crisis communication literature. So we would argue that the fields of disaster prevention and management and crisis communication have had and continue to have a blind spot vis-a-vis multilingualism. And this is something that crisis translation as a concept tries to address. So for us, this is an evolving concept. It's not that we have a very rigorous definition of what crisis translation is, but we've attempted to explain it as we go along through the research that we've conducted. I say we because I'm not the only person obviously engaged in this research, and I've collaborated quite a bit with Federico Federici from University College London, for example, and my colleague Pat Cadwell here at DCU, among others. So in 2019, Federico Federici and I tried to explain what we meant by crisis translation as any form of linguistic and cultural transmission of messages that enable access to information during an emergency, regardless of the medium. We then further elaborated on that in a volume in 2020, where we talk about crisis translation as considering language barriers in the context of multi-dimensional cascading effects that widen existing vulnerabilities or engender new ones by means of miscommunication, but also by means of non-communication. The fundamental premise behind crisis communication is that in our age of globalization, where we have increased migration and increased urbanization, communication before, during, and after a crisis must be multilingual and multicultural. And we believe that this type of communication is enabled through translation and/or interpreting. I'll come back to the before, during, and after a crisis point a little bit later. Work on this topic commenced well before COVID-19 as it happened, but as I mentioned already, the pandemic has really brought to the fore in an international way the need for attention to translation and interpreting as a form of risk reduction. And as the UN were telling us during COVID-19 all of the time, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And this, for us, suggests that in order to ensure that everyone is safe in the pandemic, you have to make sure that they have the information, accurate information, in a timely manner, in a way that they can understand. Now, we sometimes get asked, okay, so where does this fit within translation studies? Does it include interpreting? Of course, it includes interpreting. I'll probably talk about translation as a catch-all term here to include interpreting. But in a crisis in particular, our normal disciplinary barriers between translation studies and interpreting studies do not really exist. Somebody may be asked to interpret in a crisis in 1 minute and to translate something in the next. So these two are very interlinked. We've also been asked, well, where do you position this in terms of the research on translation and conflict, on development and humanitarian development, and on community translation? Because there are obviously links there between the idea of a crisis and conflict, for example. So certainly there's overlap between these areas, and we're not suggesting that crisis translation is something that should stand alone. But all of these exist on a bit of a continuum, I would say. So not all crises are conflicts or generated by conflict, for example. We need to think about levels of urgency, risk, and danger associated with these different areas. So, for example, in community translation, you might not have a very high level of danger, but if you've had an earthquake, there would be a very high level of danger. Maybe the underlying vulnerabilities of the people for whom you're translating would differ in each of these different contexts, and the nature of the content to be translated would also differ. But rather than try to decide, well, where does it fit in a discipline, I think we should recognize that actually all of these areas have an overarching goal. And that goal is to ensure that those who need relevant, accurate information in a timely manner, to ensure that their well-being and health is secured, and sometimes even that their lives are secured, that they have access to that information in a language they can understand, in a format that is accessible to them, and crucially, that they can act on in order to ensure that their own well-being. So having sort of positioned and set up what crisis translation is and what it touches on, I want to talk a little bit about the idea of the disaster cycle. So you can see a little screenshot here from a blog that tries to explain natural hazards that we are all exposed to. And you can see that it talks about the disaster cycle. In disaster studies, you will often see an image like this, which again presents disasters as a cyclic kind of an event. You have response, recovery, mitigation, and preparedness. So these are the general terms that would be used by disaster studies scholars and practitioners to talk about different phases of a disaster. When people think about translation and how it pertains to the disaster cycle, the first thing that they think about is the response stage. So let's imagine there's an earthquake and it happens in a region where there's multilingualism. Then we think, right, we need translation, we need interpreting to make sure that people are safe, they have the right information, they know where to go for fresh water and food, they know whether they should evacuate or not, and so on. And this is absolutely the case. Translation plays a really big role in the response stage. However, we would argue that translation also plays a really big role in recovery, mitigation, and preparedness. And these are stages in a disaster cycle where translation and interpreting has largely been overlooked. But of course, in all of these stages, you have information that you need to communicate out to people to ensure, for example, that they are doing the right things in terms of recovery, or that they are doing the right things in terms of being prepared for the next disaster. But it's also really important to point out that within disaster studies, there is some contest to this notion of disaster as a cycle. There's a very nice paper from Bosher et al. From 2021 that argues that we should stop talking about disasters in terms of cycles, because that suggests that we just go around in circles and we never learn from the events and how to be better prepared for them or how to better respond to them. Instead, they propose this idea of a helix where you have an event, we respond, we learn, and when that event or something similar occurs again, our time to response is lower because we have learned from what we did previously. So for them, this image illustrates disasters as trying to reduce the risk and trying to reduce negative impacts over time by having risk reduction interventions. So learning each time, having an intervention which reduces the risk for the next time that something happens. Now, they don't talk about translation in this context at all, but our contention would be that in order to reduce risk over time, translation is a risk intervention. It is a tool for helping people to reduce the risks that we're all exposed to over the period of time that we might be facing a crisis or a disaster. So taking all of that into account, and the fact that we would say that there is a blind spot in terms of disaster studies and crisis communication around the need for multilingual information, I would say that over the past 10 years or so, we have made some progress in terms of addressing this blind spot by doing research, giving talks, getting involved with the disaster studies community, and so on. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the research that has started to fill that gap. But I want to emphasize this isn't an exhaustive literature review, so I'm not covering absolutely everything that has been published. I'll draw attention, first of all, to a volume that was published by Federico Federici. He was the editor of this, called Mediating Emergencies and Conflicts. Some of you might already have come across this volume. And just to give you a little taste of the topics that were covered in there, there were chapters on interpreting in the emergency department, on training for interpreters who work in emergency response, on military interpreting, and on translator training for the Ebola response in Kenya. In the introduction, the Interact project was mentioned, so I want to just tell you a little bit about that. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about it, but I'm mentioning it because it acted as a stimulus for a lot of the research that my colleagues and I have published. So the Interact project was funded by the EU from 2017 to 2020, so just a 3-year project. Its full title was the International Network in Crisis Translation. And you can see here a link to the project website, which gives you all of the information about what we worked on, who was involved, all of our outputs, and so on. And we still try to keep this website live with our follow-on work, even though the project itself has come to a close. So if you're interested, you can just go to that link, or if you want to just search for Crisis Translation Interact, you'll find the website, and you'll be able to see the work that we did, which was multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary, and which has really, I think, helped us to make progress in our research. One of the outputs from that project was an edited volume called Translation in Cascading Crisis. So again, I'm just highlighting some of the topics that were covered there to give you an idea of the research that was carried out. And not all of this comes from the Interact project, I hasten to add. There are chapters in there from lots of different people. So we cover mediating gender-based violence in migrant flows, human trafficking and police communication, use of translation technology in non-governmental organizations, accessibility of multilingual information, integrating language needs in disaster research, and intralingual translation for readability and comprehensibility in crisis communication. And just to say here that when we talk about translation, we often are talking about interlingual translation, but when it comes to crisis communication, intralingual translation is also required because we very often have literacy concerns and issues around comprehension, readability, and so on. And the last work I'm going to highlight here is another edited volume with myself and Federico Federici called Translating Crisis, which I'm very pleased to say will be available from Bloomsbury from November the 17th. Here again, we cover topics, and of course, you'll see the impact and influence of the pandemic coming in here too. So misinformation in crisis and risk management, provision of sign language interpreting during COVID-19, the role of translation in ensuring children's rights in migration from Mexico to the US. And we're very pleased that there are 5 chapters in this volume which were contributed by authors from NGOs who are dealing with translation and interpreting very much on the front line. So we have contributions from Amnesty International, the New Zealand Red Cross, Go Global, International Organization for Migration, and an independent researcher who works on homelessness. So if you're interested, of course, I urge you to check this out because there's 25 chapters in total written by lots of different people from lots of different perspectives. So as I've said, we've started to plug the gap that we noticed in terms of looking at the role of translation and interpreting in crisis settings. But I think we still have a long way to go. So what is required in order to move forward? For sure, we need increased awareness of translation and interpreting as risk reduction tools and not just as responses to a crisis. We need to have the increased awareness then recognized in policy and in practice. We also need to have more training. And by this, I would say, I mean training for translators and interpreters, for translation scholars, but also for those who use translation and interpreting services in crisis settings. And we need technology support. So I'm going to focus in on a couple of these areas that I've just mentioned to give you a taste of some of the research that has already gone on. First of all, in looking at emergency management policies, citizen translator training, and technology and crisis translation. So the first topic is to do with emergency response policies. During the Interact project, we were very curious to find out what do national emergency response policies actually say about translation? Do they say anything about translation? So we did some research, as you can see here, we've published this in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction in 2018. And I'm going to give you just a very quick overview of what we did and what we found. First of all, though, I want to talk a little bit about what qualifies as policy when we're talking about emergency response policies. As we learned, policy is a very difficult thing to define because it can be formal or it can be informal. It can be called something like framework or guidelines, so it's not always called policy. Policy can be documented or maybe not even documented, and it can exist at lots of different levels. So you might have a local policy, a regional or federal policy, a national policy, or an international policy. So it's a very broad concept that's difficult to tie down. When we think about policy and what role it might play, in general, we have to recognize that policy doesn't guarantee appropriate action necessarily, but without a policy, appropriate action might be less likely to happen. This is because policy sometimes dictates what resources will be made available for something and what action might be taken. And it also provides guidance on something that we should live up to. So it does play a really important role, that we recognize that you can still have good outcomes, even if something's not enshrined in policy. What we did during this project was we analysed 5 national emergency response policies. Now, if you want to read a little bit more in detail about why we picked these countries that you can see on the list here, and what documents we actually analysed and so on, please go to the paper, because I don't intend to go into a whole lot of detail about this. But you can see that we analysed the policies from Ireland, the UK, Japan, USA, and New Zealand. We looked at these policies through the analytical lens of the 4A standards. Now, the 4A standards were not developed in relation to disasters and crises, but rather in relation to accessibility of the right to education. But we thought it was a very useful way of looking at the right to translation. So we took the 4A standards and used it as a lens to consider whether translation and the right to translation was enshrined in those policies from the 5 countries that I've just mentioned. The 4A's stand for availability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability. So a summary of our findings, which will probably be of no surprise to most of you, is that the right to translated information is generally not foregrounded in national emergency response policies, or not in the ones that we analysed. But it is a little bit more complicated than that, or a little bit more nuanced. If you look at it in more detail, we were able to say that the policy from Ireland, the UK, and New Zealand showed only very superficial awareness of the need for multilingual communication in a crisis. Japan, on the other hand, showed better awareness, so they recognized more the importance of translation and interpreting in crisis response. And a little bit surprising to us, I suppose, was that the USA showed the best awareness, because in fact, they have a separate policy called the Language Access Plan for emergency response. Now, if you look at the Language Access Plan, it actually is more concerned with bilingualism, Spanish and English, and doesn't really recognize the need for translation into many other languages. But their policy was the best, at least, of the ones that we had to look at. We're also curious about, well, what do international organizations that do humanitarian response, for example, say about the need for translation and interpreting? And to investigate that part, we interviewed members of different international non-governmental organizations who were providing translation. And we've written a report on this, which again is available through the Interact website. The key finding from those interviews was that the organizations recognize the absolute importance of providing translation and interpreting in humanitarian operations. But at the time when we interviewed them, at least, their capacity to formalize or routinize that requirement were limited. And generally that comes down to not having it enshrined in policy, not having budgets, not having dedicated resources for it, and obviously having other priorities like food, medicine, water, and so on. So out of all of this work, we have produced 10 high-level recommendations, which again, you can access here. And I'll just talk you through those recommendations. So these recommendations are available to any organization, government, non-governmental, to consider whether they are really addressing the need for multilingual crisis communication. They're really very simple. And for those of us working in translation and interpreting, they are perhaps even too simple. But given that we're starting from such a low point, hopefully they might be useful to people. So I'll run through these quite quickly. First of all, we recommended that emergency management communication policies should include provision for translation and interpreting, and should be regularly reviewed and revised. That there should be a specific owner of the policy because without an owner of a policy, it'll probably just get forgotten about. That these policies must be developed in consultation with relevant multilingual and multicultural communities. There's no point in an organization just coming up with a recommendation or a policy by themselves without consulting with the groups or people that they want to serve. That they should cover all phases of a crisis and disaster, as I've mentioned previously. That they need to look at what languages are spoken by affected communities, including obviously sign language, but also to consider things like the levels of literacy among those communities and how they're going to ensure the cultural appropriateness of the communication. That it can't all be about just text or just audio, but you need to think about different formats and different channels for disseminating crisis information. That they must allow for two-way communication. So again, we've seen a tendency where organizations might just translate something, put it on the website, and they think, okay, that's the job done. But actually, what if it's not enough? What if the communities need more or need something else? So there has to be an openness to two-way communication. That training must be provided for people who are doing the translation and interpreting, but also the people who are using the translation and interpreting. That there should be direct lines of communication between emergency response organizations and professional associations of translators and interpreters to ensure collaboration, which would be really important. And the last one is that when you're recruiting into a multilingual organization who is responsible for emergency response, that you need to not just be reliant on a lingua franca or ad hoc convenience translation and interpreting. So those are our 10 policy recommendations. But it's really important to note that with a policy, you're not guaranteed implementation. But the flip side of that, as we discovered, is that implementation is not necessarily dependent on having a formal policy. We discovered this when we did some follow-up research. This was with my colleague, Patrick Cadwell, who's also at DCU. We got some funding to do a rapid response research project in the very early months of the pandemic to look at Ireland's maturity level in terms of its provision of translation and interpreting during the first stages of the pandemic. First of all, we looked at Ireland's emergency response documentation that we had analysed in 2017. And despite our wonderful policy recommendations, which we tried to communicate to our government, there were no revisions to our emergency response policy to increase awareness about translation and interpreting. However, our organisation who dealt with communicating health information to all of the population did translate into 24 different languages during COVID-19. So we see that there is an element of maturity here where at least translation was being thought about and acted upon. We used a maturity model for crisis translation, which we developed ourselves on the basis of another maturity model to score Ireland's performance. And if you want to read a little bit more about that, you'll see the link to our open access publication here. But just to tell you a little bit about the maturity model that we deployed here. We took the organizational maturity model for disaster preparedness, which was developed by Mohammed and Koo in Australia. Now, they look at crisis response generally, but they do talk about communication within this maturity model. But of course, they don't talk about multilingual communication or translation. And we thought this was a very appropriate maturity model for what we wanted to look at. As you can see here, it has 5 different levels ranging from ad hoc to optimizing. And then there are different explanations for each level in the maturity model. So we took this, we looked at all the evidence we had from documentation, interviews, and so on. And we scored Ireland on this maturity model. The aggregated scoring led us to place my country on level 2 of the maturity model, which means it's at a repeatable level. Consistent management processes are being applied. But this is only level 2, and we found that there were lots of room for improvement, and we made recommendations, of course, about how we could become more mature in terms of our crisis translation response. So that's the bit about policy and a little bit of a snapshot about what we've been doing around policy and crisis translation. The next bit that I want to move on to talking about is about training and who does the translating in a crisis. So, of course, coming from translation studies and looking at the profession, the obvious answer to this is professional translators and interpreters should be the ones doing the translation. But in a crisis, it's an unusual situation, and sometimes translators or interpreters are in short supply, or they're actually not even available, or they don't exist. Maybe they don't exist for the languages that are involved in the crisis, because we don't have formal training programs in interpreting and translation in every country. Or maybe there aren't enough of them to respond to the demand for translating and interpreting information. And another interesting aspect of this is that translators and interpreters might be impacted themselves by a particular crisis if they're living in an area where an earthquake or a flood or a wildfire has taken place. So they may not be available to actually do any translation and interpreting. So as a result, and as you can well imagine, crises often call on volunteers. So I want to take a few minutes to talk about volunteering in crisis response in general. So there's a very strong tradition of volunteering by professionals and amateurs in response to a crisis, whether they be medical professionals or engineers or just your average person who wants to help. The New Zealand Ministry of Civil Defence and Emergency Management has an interesting document where they talk about managing volunteers in a crisis. And they say that volunteering is a legitimate way in which people can participate in the activities in their community. And also, interestingly, that it's an activity that deserves recognition and respect. Of course, for us in translation studies, volunteer translation is a challenging concept. We'll often get responses to the idea of amateur translators or volunteer translators in a crisis, which say, but the stakes are really high if the translation is wrong. Obviously, somebody could even lose their lives. This is very true, and this is something that we need to really consider. But the stakes are also very high if there's no information available, or if the crisis responders are using, say, only machine translation as the source of information. We need to recognize that there are different types of content and different levels of risk in all of the different stages of a crisis. And so maybe not everything should be translated by an amateur, of course, but there are perhaps types of content where it is less risky to translate than to not translate at all. Our take on this during the Interact project in particular was like, let's not condemn, but let's see if we can educate. So we set about trying to provide some educational material for anybody who wanted to learn about translation and apply it in the case of a crisis or an emergency. So what you can see here are little thumbnails from our crisis translation YouTube channel, where we delivered 101 course content on translation. So what is translation? What is terminology? What is machine translation? What's post-editing? What do you need to do if you're going to post-edit? So you can see the thumbnails here. Some of these courses are 2 minutes long, 3 minutes long, so really, really short snapshots so that people who know nothing about translation can learn a little bit about them at least. Then on top of the course content that we delivered during Interact, we also have posted some videos there on the project that we did looking at Ireland's crisis translation maturity model. We have an executive summary of that in Irish Sign Language. And then we also have videos on a more recent terminology project that I'll tell you about in a little while. So that's our 101 YouTube content. But in addition to that, we worked together in the Interact project with University College London and the University of Auckland to co-design a master's module for translation students on crisis translation. We first delivered this in the University of Auckland together as a team. Then it was rolled out separately in UCL, and we deliver it also at DCU and have done that for about 3 or 4 years now. So this is targeted at, in our case, students who are on the MSc in Translation Technology here. And we also have MA students in Refugee Integration who take the module. We have these two sets of students who come together to learn about the importance of translation and interpreting in crisis and humanitarian response. And it's really wonderful to have these two different kinds of students with different ways of thinking in a classroom, learning about language rights, access, the right to translation. And we hope that they'll go out and be advocates and lobbyists for the role of translation and interpreting as risk reduction tools. Okay, so I'll move on now to the third area that I wanted to focus on, which is translation technology and crisis response. We have, of course, opposing views on this. So when you talk about translating for a crisis, those who don't know much about translation or machine translation say, why not just use machine translation? And even, why not just use pictures? Why do you even have to use text? So this is something that I want to address. On the other hand, in translation studies, we might say machine translation is far too risky to use in a crisis. And we also think that because it's an immediate response to something and there's no prediction going on, that normal translation memory tools, for example, don't apply in a crisis. So let me address some of those questions now. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about why not just use pictures or pictograms. So quite a bit of work has been done on the pros and cons of pictograms as a communication tool in general. And of course, there are very many benefits to them. So drawing on Tijus et al. From 2007, the benefits might be that they can be interpreted more accurately and more quickly than words. They can improve understanding of warnings if you have people with visual or literacy difficulties. They can grab attention. They're very good when the task is routine, and they can be more easily processed at a distance. So there's certainly benefits. But on the other hand, there are drawbacks to pictograms. And the first one is that very few pictograms are universally understood, that it can take many years for a pictogram to reach its maximum effectiveness or comprehension. And there's also serious potential for confusion or opposite meaning generation. So there are definitely issues with just using pictograms. Some research on the use of pictograms in the medical and pharmaceutical fields has shown us that pictograms will improve comprehension when used in combination with text. So text plus picture seems to be one of the most effective combinations. But they also tell us that pictograms need to be culturally specific, gender specific, age specific, context specific, education level specific, developed and tested over time. And again, that they're good for recall of routine information. So to conclude on the pictogram question, I would say using just pictograms is just as challenging, if not more challenging, than using text. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. Focusing in on pictograms, I wanted to highlight a chapter that I've co-authored with Adriano, who introduced me and introduced the session earlier in this volume that we mentioned earlier, where we looked at safety signs and if they are truly universal when a crisis occurs. In it, we've argued that colors, symbols, shapes, and gestures are not universal, and they really depend on sociocultural and historical references, that they are subject to misunderstanding, but actually there's been very little research done on this. And so we think that translation studies with its intersemiotic lens could make a really interesting contribution to looking at risk reduction by looking at the universality of signs and symbols. So moving on then to the question about machine translation. Should it be used in a crisis? Should it not? Some of you might be aware that machine translation has been used in crisis. The most best known example is the rapid development of an English Haitian Creole machine translation system following the Haiti earthquake in 2010, which was created because it was realized that when the international responders went to Haiti, they were having difficulty actually communicating with the local responders. They just assumed that they would all speak English, of course, but they didn't. So they tried to create an English to Haitian Creole MT system. Of course, we all know that there are many issues with machine translation, such as accuracy issues, these days misleading fluency because of neuro-machine translation. But also when it comes to crises, like the Haitian crisis, there can be a lack of digital language resources for all the possible language pairs that might be required to deploy in a crisis. And indeed, if you're in a crisis or a disaster setting, you are likely to be facing issues with regards to infrastructure. So maybe your broadband is not working, maybe you have no power. So if your machine translation system relies on any of those, of course, you will be in trouble. Some research that's recently been published, actually very, very recently, so just in the last number of weeks, comes from Pim and colleagues, and it's been published in a new journal called JUST, which is the Journal of Language Rights and Minorities. And you can see the link here. So this is also an open access article. And they looked at the use of machine translation in crisis response. In particular, they were looking at the Catalan Health Service and the information that they were presenting on COVID-19 vaccination. What they observed was that the Catalan Health Service was using free online machine translation in order to communicate this health information. And of course, they were able to identify some specific problematic outputs from that machine translation system. But the article is interesting because it doesn't just point to the problems of doing this. Rather, it also says there are some strategic advantages in using machine translation in a pandemic, for example, which is the speed at which information can be disseminated and the coverage of languages. And the conclusion here is that most of the problems that we identify with the use of machine translation in these settings can be solved through better education of the people who are deploying the machine translation systems. So in other words, through better machine translation literacy. So as to the question, should we simply rule out machine translation in a crisis? I think no, machine translation literacy is key. So we need to be talking about education, but also machine translation might have a role to play, which depends on a few different things. We need to consider what is the level of risk if the content is mistranslated, for example. And we also need to consider what's the general quality of the output from the machine translation system, which of course should be tested in advance of using it for any crisis response. What about the use of tools that we're very familiar with, like translation memory? So of course, a translation memory tool might not be suitable for the type of content that you might want to translate during the immediate response to a crisis. But if we look at the type of content that might be translated for preparedness, for mitigation, for recovery, here we would have maybe longer texts with more repetition and a less urgent timescale. So of course, translation memory could be used in some of those settings. And then we have terminology management and the tools around terminology management. Terminology in humanitarian development, in disaster response is really, really important. But what we generally tend to see where terminology has been translated into multiple languages is that they are simply available as downloadable PDFs on a website. Now, this, of course, has some uses, but the uses are limited in a crisis response. What we really need are culturally specific, multilingual term bases that are enabled on offline mobile apps, for example, because maybe we can't actually access the internet during a particular phase of a crisis. So let me give you an example of some of the research that has been done here and some of the development. This project was led by Federico Federici at UCL, and he collaborated with expert linguists, disaster responders, and community stakeholders in Sierra Leone in order to translate the UN's disaster risk reduction terminology into 5 of the languages used in Sierra Leone. And going back to my, my talk there about pictograms, they also developed pictograms to accompany the terminology in order to tackle issues around low literacy among some of these language communities. This is a picture of Federico and a link to his YouTube recording explaining the background and the context to this particular project. He worked with Pius Mana, just one of the collaborators that he had on the ground in Sierra Leone. So there's also a YouTube link there to Pius explaining the linguistic landscape of Sierra Leone and how they decided on the 5 languages. They created a book that has all of the terminology collaboratively translated and the pictograms in the book as well. And now they've been working on the development of an app for mobile phones, precisely so that this terminology might be available to people in a mobile phone, for example. So as I said earlier, we've made, I think, a lot of progress by highlighting lots of areas where translation and interpreting have been forgotten about or overlooked. But, you know, we've started to raise awareness about this and comment on it and hopefully are making progress, but we still have a long way to go. So for the last little while for my talk now, I want to talk about, well, where should we go next? So here I'm going to draw on a publication from 2018 by FEMA, the US Federal Emergency Management Agency. And this document is a proposed research agenda for emergency management higher education. Now, FEMA, again, they're not talking about translation and they don't really talk much about communication in this document. But what they're trying to do is to direct the emergency management research community in a particular trajectory that they think is necessary. And they think it's necessary because crisis response is necessarily interdisciplinary and intersectoral. So people need to work together. And the overarching goal here of this document is replication of research, not duplication of research. Now, I've taken a look at this particular document and I've asked myself, well, what could translation bring to this research agenda? Do we have something to bring here? So I'll talk you through, first of all, 5 guiding principles that they outline for us. The first principle is scanning the horizon, looking at what do we already know and what's not known. So within translation studies, of course, we need to do this. What do we already know about the role of translation and interpreting or the practice of translation and interpreting in a crisis? making sure that we're not just duplicating what other people have done, but trying to find out what are the bits that we don't know yet. They recommend fostering interdisciplinarity. And of course, translation studies prides itself to some extent in being interdisciplinary. However, during the Interact project, for example, we worked with people from different disciplines, emergency response policy, disaster studies colleagues. It was very, very rewarding, but it's also very challenging to have true interdisciplinary research going on. So I think it's absolutely essential that we do that, but it's also quite challenging to do so. Embracing ethics, this is a necessity in any discussion of crisis or disaster response. Again, translation studies is very aware of the ethical components of translation in general, and I think we would have a lot to bring to the conversation there. Transferring knowledge, not just within academia. So this is essential, I think, for everything that we do, to make sure that we are talking to not just each other as academics, but talking to professional translators and interpreters, their associations, the people who use translation and interpreting and so on, to make sure that everything that we already know is being disseminated. And then the last one, which is probably the biggest challenge, is maximizing impact. So if I go back to our 10 policy recommendations, we tried to communicate those to the Irish government, for example, but we weren't very successful in doing that. So the question is, how, if you come up with really important findings that you know will make life better for people, how do you communicate that in such a way that they are listened to, taken on board, and have good outcomes for people in general? So this document then also talks about 5 research thrusts. So again, looking at this from a translation perspective, the first one has to do with justice, equity, and capacity development. And of course, translation and interpreting are very easy to link to justice, to equity, equal access to information, just treatment of people through translation and interpreting. The second and the third one are kind of linked, which is looking at research on risk and the buildup of risk in places where you are exposed to disasters and in high-risk habitation zones. And again, I hopefully have convinced you that translation and interpreting are important risk reduction tools, so we can certainly speak to this particular research agenda. The fourth one here has to do with data, technology, and societal impacts. And I've just spoken about machine translation. We're very concerned about translation data, about technology, about societal impacts of technology. So again, this is a research domain that we can speak to from translation studies into crisis response. And the last research thrust that they mention is infrastructure for humanity. And this requires just a small clarification. So what they're actually talking about here is accessibility. So sign language, accessibility for the blind, for the elderly, for those who have disabilities. And again, there are areas within translation studies that look at accessibility and how translation can enable increased accessibility. So here again, translation, I think, has a lot to bring to the table. So if we were able to speak to these research agendas that have been communicated by FEMA, then the next question is, well, what would progress look like if we were able to move forward with having translation and interpreting given greater recognition as risk reduction tools? So here I try to outline what I think progress would look like. First of all, translation would not be an afterthought in the disaster prevention and management field. It would be part of the toolbox. Secondly, budgets would be allocated for it. So if you think translation is important, but you don't have a budget for it, it probably isn't going to happen in crisis response. The focus should be on prevention, risk reduction, and preparedness, and not just on response. Resources would be created in an interdisciplinary and engaged research paradigm. So what I mean by that is that we create resources, we create research outputs with stakeholders, not for stakeholders. So we have to ensure that there is a two-way discussion, but also collaboration with the people who will require translation and interpreting. Translation technology would be used appropriately and efficiently as a crisis response tool. Appropriate training would be offered to everyone concerned on a continual basis. And finally, the greatest goal, the greatest marker of progress, I suppose, would be that suffering due to crisis would be reduced and certainly not made worse by a lack of access to timely and accurate and culturally appropriate information. So I think that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope there was something in there for you that you found some of it interesting. And I'll stop now to see if we've any questions and comments, and perhaps stop sharing my slides here as well.
Thank you, Sharon. That was a very interesting talk. And we have a couple questions here.
Okay.
They're here in the chat. Let me read them for you. Let me see. So the first question by Samira Spolidorio. What happens when a disaster or crisis has a clear perpetrator, such as Vale's case here in Brazil? Well, Vale is a mining company, and there was this accident with this trailing dam, which basically destroyed an entire city here in Brazil.
Okay.
So will they be responsible? Will such a company be responsible for providing these translation services?
Well, that's a really interesting question, but my first thought on that is there would probably be a conflict of interest if the organization responsible for the disaster is also responsible for providing the translation services. So my gut instinct is that they should not be responsible, but I'd have to think about that, I suppose, in a little bit more detail, but it sounds rather problematic, I think.
Yeah, and then she adds, and how it could make these translations more crisis communication if the company were responsible for it, right?
Yeah.
Focus on brand reputation rather than better serving the affected population, right?
Yeah, and so what's interesting here is this is like the overlap between crisis communication as reputation management and crisis communication as a response to a disaster or an event that has a really bad impact on a group of people. And of course, there are different objectives here. So the company will want to protect their reputation while also ensuring, hopefully, that those who are affected are not are protected in some way or not more seriously affected. But there's a conflict there. But there's a really interesting overlap there between the crisis communication reputation management bit and the crisis communication keep people safe bit, which, you know, there can be huge conflicts of interest there. And translation plays a role in both of those. So I do know a translator who has told me, a professional translator who works on the reputation management side of things. And how translation plays a role there is really, really interesting. But it's at the service of the organization or the company, as opposed to perhaps at the service of the people affected by the negative event. So it's an interesting ethical dilemma, I suppose, as well for translators if they are involved in this kind of translation.
Yeah, Samira just reminded me that it was actually 2 cities that were destroyed by this accident, and the company was never punished. Anyway, let's move on to the next question by Adriano. You said that Irish academics tried to talk to Irish government to improve communication during COVID-19. So what could be done to universities, governments, NGOs, and companies to really work together to improve preparedness and other steps for future crises?
Yeah, so you probably detected my slight frustration with this, in that we did engage with our health service executive who were responsible for COVID-19 communication, and they were very, very good at engaging with us. But I think it's difficult sometimes for academics to be taken seriously by government departments. And so it is a really good question. How do you get together in a room and work out what needs to be done and what everybody brings to the table? Because a government will have different objectives and different timelines compared to an academic researcher. But I firmly believe that we have really good things that we can bring to the table. And it's like, how do we get everyone together in a room where we can work through that? And I think personally that the way to do that would be to have funding that demands the collaboration between the two. And so everybody has to come to the table and participate. And if you have funding that allows you to do that, then I think you will have more progress than if you're working by yourself and trying to communicate your findings to an organization or a government. But it's tricky, it's difficult. Just, earning the trust, getting the time from those people who are often very, very busy and have other priorities. So I think it has to be enabled by funding, research funding mechanisms, really, or by having, so I've seen, this idea of secondments. So I don't know if that's a word that you're familiar with, but basically this would be where an academic goes and works in a government department for 6 months or a year, or a government official would come and work with the academic in university. And I think by doing something like that, you've also got a lot of opportunity to create trust and to collaborate in terms of real world research. So there are a few different ways you can do it, but you have to incentivize the collaboration.
And Andresa Furlan asked, how could professors who are not experts in disaster studies approach the role of translation and risk reduction in order to raise awareness about this field to the class? Do you recommend any particular activity?
Oh, okay, that's a really big question. Okay, so I'll tell you, one of the things that we do in our own module, which works quite well, but it takes a bit of time, so you'd have to have time to factor this into your class, is that we ask our students to think about a crisis situation. It can be one that they heard about or one that they were actually affected by, or a fictional one. And they have to come up with a kind of a profile for the types of communication and the languages that would be required in that scenario. And who would require information about what, in which languages, in what formats. And then having done that, they have to write a language access plan. So this is like a sort of a plan that says, should this kind of emergency occur with these particular kind of languages, with these people, here's how we are going to ensure access to information. And they present on that. So first of all, they present the scenario, and we give them a little bit of feedback on that. And after they get the feedback, they then have to write the language access plan, and that's part of their assignment. And I think that really raises awareness. The one thing that I would say about that, however, just to be careful about it is that sometimes our students, we've discovered, were involved in a crisis of some kind, whether that was like they could be asylum seekers themselves, or they might have been in an earthquake, for example. And so if you ask them to talk about these things, sometimes it also brings back very negative trauma. So you have to warn them in advance that, you know, they might want to think about a scenario that is not going to really re-traumatize them if they've been through a trauma. Although if they have been through it, they know it intimately and they really would like to talk about it. But we do have to be careful and make sure that they're not, you know, really negatively affected by doing this exercise. But that works very well for us. We see some really good work from the students, because they don't have to be necessarily really well read in disaster response, as long as they know about language and translation, and they can think about a multilingual crisis situation. They can come up with really good language access plans. So I hope that gives you an idea.
Adriano has another question. You said in the beginning that communication before, during, and after a crisis must be multilingual and multicultural. Can we put the word multisemiotic in this phrase too?
Yeah, and maybe a question that raises for me is it multisemiotic, or do we call it multimodal? So we see a lot of discussion about multimodality in terms of communication. In crisis settings, we see some recognition that communication has to be multimodal, but not a massive recognition of that either, I have to say. So this is definitely something that we need to try and raise awareness of as well. For example, if I go back to the Irish context, a lot of the translations that I mentioned, the 24 languages, were just being put on the Health Service Executive website. And we have a very big Polish community in Ireland, for example. But in order to find that information, so this was all the information in the early days about wearing a mask, social distancing, all these kind of things. You had to go to their English language website and type into the search box Polish to find the information, right? So that's an accessibility problem. But apart from that, there's an even bigger problem, which is that most of the Polish had never heard of the Health Service Executive. You know, they didn't know what this organization was. And yet this was the organization that was responsible for communicating to them. So just posting textual translations hidden somewhere on a website is not going to be effective communication. So we have to think about what other modalities could we use to get to, in this example, the Polish community living in Ireland. And I will give you maybe a little bit extra information here. We managed to do that, but not through the government. We managed to do that through a grassroots organization called Translate Ireland, who was simply a journalist and his wife, who was a doctor, who basically discovered many of her patients did not understand the information or could not find the information being given by the Irish government. So they took it on themselves to use her multilingual network to create short videos, 1 minute, less than 1 minute, say a Polish doctor saying, I'm from Poland, I live and work in Ireland, wear a mask and keep your distance. This is really important information. In Polish, a little video, which was then posted via WhatsApp to the Polish community in Ireland. That was really effective. And what's interesting now is that now those people are working with our health service executive because they've been so successful. So I think we're learning as we go along, but we're certainly learning that you need to communicate in different ways to different communities, and just putting something on an official website will not be effective.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because I think most people don't really read websites that much anymore. So social media nowadays plays a pivotal role, right? When we are trying to get information. So, and that's also another question I have. Is there more research about the importance of social media in these contexts of crisis and translation?
Absolutely. And, you know, during our research on translation for COVID in Ireland, we tried to reach our large Brazilian community that lives in Ireland as well. That was a little bit more difficult, but we managed to interview 2 Brazilians who were working here, and we confirmed what we thought was the case, which was from their perspective, they were looking for information about the COVID-19 virus through Brazilian websites and from their social networks in Brazil. And you guys probably all know that that information was quite different to what maybe the Irish government was saying, right? So this was really interesting, because you have social media communicating information from networks in a whole other part of the world that did not match what was being communicated officially here. And then, of course, they didn't know what to believe and who to believe, and they were translating for each other via social media networks. So somebody was saying, well, no, the Irish government said, ... I've translated what they posted on their website here, you know, resharing that via social media, which of course conflicted with what was being said in Brazil at the time. So this is you know, it's a global communication network these days, right? So it's really, really complicated.
That's a very interesting point, because as you all know, we have a government that contributed to spread misinformation about the pandemic, just like the United States in the previous administration as well, in the beginning of the pandemic. And so even here in Brazil, many scientists, they were actually trying to show data from other parts of the world to show, hey, don't trust the data from the government here. So translation again was playing a very important role here. Yeah,
absolutely. But this comes back to the point that I made earlier, that what seemed to work really well eventually was for the officials here to talk directly to, for example, the Brazilians who were living in Ireland, and not just posting information on their website, but having direct contact. And here the role of the sort of leaders in the community is very important. So you'll have, you know, natural leaders there who will step up and talk to the government and then try to communicate that information back to their own network. And that's a level of trust. I think the government realized, oh, we can establish trust here if we go through the community themselves. Yeah. And so I think we've learned a lot from just what are the even if you put aside translation, what are the best communication techniques in this kind of setting?
And before we move on to the next question, one last question about this topic. Do you have any data about how effective in the end that strategy was, in the sense that, okay, the Brazilian community finally trusted the official information from the Irish government? Or is there data that maybe some members of the community decided to distrust the Irish government and preferred to follow the Brazilian government's guidelines in the end?
So I don't have any data on that, but I expect that there is data. And I think the data would be, the most interesting data would be in the form of the uptake on vaccinations at different points in time, right? Yeah. So here in Ireland, we were as soon as a vaccination was made available, we were queuing for hours to get our vaccinations. And, you know, I was hearing that, for example, the Polish community had very low uptake on vaccination. And this is cultural. So it was explained to me that they don't tend to trust information coming from official sources. So even if it was coming from the Irish government, there now, government is telling me to be vaccinated, I'm not going to do that. Whereas the Irish trust their government for better or for worse. So if the government said, get your vaccination, we were queuing up from early morning to get the vaccination. So it would be interesting to look at, for example, the levels of vaccination among Polish, among Brazilian in Ireland compared to those levels elsewhere. And that would be some indication, I suppose, of the level of trust of the information that was being given. So I'm sure that information exists somewhere, but I don't have it, unfortunately.
Very interesting. Next question by Jacqueline Borden from Sweden. So what you are basically saying that students should rehearse on a fictional crisis, and find out possible solutions for those crises, right?
More or less, yeah. They have to, in our exercise, they have to think about a crisis setting. It could be, you know, an asylum seeker or migrant camp, or it could be an earthquake in Japan and I'm a tourist and I'm there with my family. Could be a pandemic, obviously, you know, so we get them to think about a specific crisis setting, to locate it geographically, to think about the language communities that would be affected by that, what kind of information they might need, who would need the information and how it would be communicated to them. And then they have to write a language access plan to ensure that that could be carried out if that particular crisis were to occur. So that is hopefully clarifies what I meant, yeah.
I have one question about the issue of voluntary translation, yes, which I think it's a rather contentious issue in translation studies, right?
Yeah.
So because many people nowadays complain that the professional translator is getting more and more a member of the precariat.
Yes.
The working conditions are harder and harder. But in this case here, of course, there are situations here in which we'll have to rely, as you showed, that we have to rely on voluntary translators, non-professional ones, and so on. But to what extent are maybe governments thinking, okay, let's just rely on these voluntary translators whenever we need them, and let's not really worry in trying to maybe hire professional translators and having to pay them good fees and so on.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is a very good question. I mean, it's hard to say to what extent governments are doing this, but I think if I go back to the interviews we did with the international NGOs, they are, the ones we interviewed at least, were relying on their multilingual staff mostly to do translation. And those people were not hired as translators, nor were they trained as translators. So it is certainly, it's something that's done on an ad hoc basis. There's not much consideration given to training or qualifications. And in fact, the people who get asked to do translation in an NGO, sometimes they're just being asked to do that on top of what they're supposed to do on a daily basis. So I think it is happening to a large extent. And it's our role to try to express, I think, the reasons why governments should have links with professional translators and interpreters. Our HSE, again, going back to that particular example, when they translated those 24 languages, they weren't using, initially at least, they weren't using amateur volunteer translators. They had already 2 translation agencies that they would normally go to if they needed some translation. And they had a standard operating procedure already in place for working with those 2 translation agencies. So the fact that they had this standard operating procedure meant that they didn't have to go looking around for a translation agency and what languages can you provide and how much are you going to charge us. That was all already, you know, in place. So they were just able to give them content very quickly and try and get it back in 24 hours. So those links with professional organizations or professional commercial agencies allowed them to respond very quickly. And I think we should encourage, of course, to have that. And I think then if we really encourage translation and interpreting in preparation stages, in recovery stages, and in mitigation, that you'll have those links already established, and they will realize that you cannot just rely on anybody and everybody around you who happens to speak a little bit of German or a little bit of Portuguese to do translation. And so if they're looking at translation in the broader sense of things, then I think when a crisis hits, that will enable more engagement of professionals than amateurs. But it's a big issue. It is a big issue.
Yeah, and this has also made me think about the nature of translation, and that access to translation in these contexts of disasters, of crises, of migration crises, and so on, is a human right. And that's what I was thinking about. Translation, access to translation as a human right.
This is true. And one of the citations we have in some of our work is of a really nice report written by the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, who exactly say that access to information in a crisis is a humanitarian right. And that includes translation. So this is one way of looking at it. So for sure, yeah.
And it also gives us another way to look at translation, because sometimes we view translation as, especially when we focus too much on the translation of literary texts or other types of texts as this technical job and so on, we think of it as, you know, translator is usually somebody that betrays the source language, the source text, whatever. We always think translation as something less than, right? But here in this context, we see translation as something essential for life, for survival.
Exactly. And what you've said has just reminded me of an interesting conversation I had recently with some researchers in Sweden who were looking at Sweden's response in translation during the COVID pandemic. And one thing we tend to forget is that sometimes this content, especially if it's in the response stage to a crisis, it is written, the source language is written very quickly, and it might not be very well written. So we're really focusing on maybe translation is not good in a crisis, and if you do it too quickly, or if an amateur volunteer does it. But actually those who are writing the content in the first place are under a lot of pressure too. So the source language might be not of great quality. And certainly not much attention, I think, has been given to the accessibility of the source text in terms of readability and suitability for people who have low literacy skills, never mind translation. So I think that as we work on this and lobby for it, we need to also be really looking at the source content and who's creating that and supporting them to create better content, which obviously will help in the translation as well.
We have another question by Andres Furlan. Considering the vaccination case in Ireland and the difference between Irish and Polish cultures, could we say that cultural clusters play an essential role in preparing implementation strategies, Could you comment a bit more about it?
Yes, I completely agree. I think this is something that I suppose if you're just thinking about translation and text, and we know it's a cultural thing, right? But we don't focus too much on cultural differences. But this really came to the fore during the pandemic, when you saw people around you behaving differently because of where they came from, because of their cultural understanding or distrust of government or official information. During our work on the COVID response in Ireland, we had a lovely research assistant working with us who was Polish, as it happened, and who had studied in Ireland for a long time. And she did some interviews translating for us with some Polish participants. And she was able to confirm that in the Polish community in Ireland, the conversation was all about, you know, don't believe anything that you're hearing, don't go get those vaccinations, they're going to kill you. And she explained to us that this is because this is a huge generalization, of course, but that in general, the Polish people don't trust their government. And so that is transferred wherever you go, you bring that cultural understanding with you, and that plays a big role. So I think that when official organizations are thinking about communicating in other languages, it's much more multi-layered than that. It's not just let's make the information available in Brazilian Portuguese. It's like, how do the Brazilians in Ireland think? And how do we ensure that we understand how they think so we can communicate with them in a way that's appropriate to them? That's what we need to be doing. But of course, that's very, very demanding, I think, of any organization in normal times, never mind when you're responding to an emergency. So I guess the work has to be done up front. You know, you need to be thinking about that before an emergency happens. How do we communicate with our Chinese community? How do we communicate with our Brazilians? How do we communicate with the Polish? What works for each one of these? Do you tailor the messages? Who do you go through? What channels do you use? What kind of language? Those are the things that we should be thinking about, I think.
Yeah, it's very interesting because as societies nowadays are more fragmented and tribalized.
Yeah. Yes.
So translation and interpreting has to bridge this gap, right?
Yes. Yes,
when we are facing with a crisis, when we need people to sort of come together somehow.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, we are very tribal. We do work that way. Even when people come and live in another country, they all come together. The Irish all come together in whatever country they're in. You know. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a comment here by Anita Di Marco. Excellent lecture and event. Thank you and congrats. Another comment by Jacqueline Nurdan. Indeed, excellent lecture. Thanks for sharing so much, Susan. That was indeed a very interesting and excellent lecture, and a field that is still, I think, very new here in Brazil, very fresh here in Brazil. So I think we all have learned a lot here today, a lot of important information here, for sure.
Thank you so much. That's really nice to hear, and I'm sure you'll have some very interesting observations to make about translation in crisis in Brazil, for sure.
I don't think we have any more questions.
Okay.
After a few quite good and interesting questions, would you have any last comments, Sharon, where people can find you, or people can find out about your work and so on?
Well, so you can just Google me. You'll find my profile, my DCU profile, and my email address is there. And I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn as well, if anyone is using those channels. Our publications are all listed on my website, and some of them are open and free. You might have access to them. Some of them are not, as academic publishing goes, but also have a look at the Interact website. That's easy to find if anyone wants to look at those resources, or the YouTube channel that I mentioned. And I suppose really what I want to say is I haven't worked alone on any of this. I've talked about a couple of my colleagues, but there are more besides that I've worked with to raise awareness and create publications and so on. So this is a very much a collaborative effort.
Samara also made a comment. Thank you for everything. Muito obrigado a todos. Thank you again. Thank you so much. E acho que é isso para hoje, o evento de hoje. Adriano, você gostaria de fazer mais algum comentário?
Sim, muito obrigado novamente. Sharon, thank you again. Thanks for to be here with us. Pessoal, bom, nós encerramos então a palestra por hoje, mas ainda não encerramos a nossa programação. Ainda temos agora à tarde oficinas, também teremos palestras, à noite sessões de comunicação. Então fiquem conosco aí, acompanhem a nossa programação. E acho que é isso. Muito obrigado a todos e até mais. See you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.